the dark corners of the world, where myth and reality collide, some truths are too dangerous to ignore, and some invitations are too tempting to resist. Sophia Aldridge was a young cultural anthropologist, passionate about studying supernatural myths, particularly those involving vampires. She didn't necessarily believe in the fantastical, but there was something captivating about how vampire myths had been passed down through centuries. It wasn't the creatures themselves that intrigued her, but rather the unshakable hold these creatures had on human culture. One late fall afternoon, while facing a bit of a dead end in her research, Sophia received an invitation from a prestigious research institute in London, offering her a chance to dive deeper into why vampires fascinated people across the world. Eager to pursue the question that had lingered in her mind for years, she packed up her life in New York and headed to London, determined to uncover the mysteries surrounding these ancient myths. Digging into the history of vampires. Upon arriving in London, Sophia joined a team of scholars focusing on vampire folklore across cultures. Their goal: to understand why vampire stories continue to captivate people throughout history. They began by looking into the famous legends like the story of Dracula and broader folklore from around the world, trying to pinpoint why these legends held such a consistent, universal appeal. As Sophia worked her way through the research, she made an unexpected discovery. Vampires weren't just a part of Eastern European tales or Gothic novels. They appeared in countless cultures, Middle Eastern myths, African legends, and even ancient Asian folklore. And what stood out the most was the similarity in how vampires were portrayed across these cultures. These creatures were often described as both alluring and terrifying, beings that combined immortality with death, power with brutality. But why, she wondered, did so many cultures craft these kinds of creatures? What did they represent? Was there something deeper behind these myths? An unlikely encounter. As Sophia delved deeper into vampire mythology, she had an odd encounter that would change everything. One evening, while speaking at a small gathering of scholars, she met Victor, a man who casually claimed to have lived for centuries. At first, Sophia thought he was simply eccentric, someone obsessed with vampire fiction. But as their conversation unfolded, Victor shared a chilling claim. He was a real vampire. Sophia's skepticism was apparent, but Victor didn't seem to be trying to impress her. He spoke with conviction, as if the weight of centuries of knowledge sat behind every word. According to Victor, the real reason vampires fascinated humans wasn't because they were monstrous creatures of the night. No, it was something more profound. Vampires represented the very things humans desired most: immortality, absolute power, eternal beauty. And somewhere, deep down, humans weren't just afraid of vampires. They were drawn to them, craving what they symbolized. Sophia wasn't sure what to believe. Could this man really be what he claimed? Yet, the more she listened, the more she realized that there was more to the vampire myth than she'd ever considered. These creatures weren't just part of folklore. They were symbolic representations of human desires, dark desires, the growing mystery. Sophia began to question everything. She had started this research with one question in mind: why were humans fascinated with vampires? But now she was facing a far larger question. Could it be that the very reason we were so captivated by vampires was rooted in something primal? Something buried deep inside every one of us? Something that went beyond just the allure of immortality? Could it be that we were attracted to vampires because they reflected our own darkest desires, our fears of death, and our inability to accept mortality? That night, after reading through ancient vampire texts and folklore, Sophia began to experience strange dreams. In her dreams, a man appeared, someone she'd never met, but who seemed so familiar. He had the unmistakable eyes of a vampire. These dreams, vivid and haunting, made Sophia question everything she thought she knew about herself and her work. Were the stories she had been studying simply tales, or did they speak to something far deeper within her? After the strange encounter with Victor, Sophia's curiosity grew into an obsession. The more she read, the more she couldn't ignore the nagging question: why were vampires so alluring? There had to be something more behind their representation in so many cultures, something universal. This wasn't just about bloodsuckers and night creatures. It was something much darker, more psychological. Sophia and her research team began to gather more than just books and ancient texts. They sought out modern interpretations of the vampire myth, particularly focusing on pop culture's role in reshaping the image of the vampire. From Twilight to Interview with the Vampire, the modern portrayal of vampires had become more human, more relatable, and in some ways more desirable. One particular book, an old manuscript written in the 16th century, caught Sophia's attention. It was a diary of an anonymous nobleman describing a vampire cult in Europe, one that took place centuries ago. The diary was peculiar because it wasn't just a story about drinking blood. It was a detailed account of the vampire cult's rituals, which focused on transcending human limitations. Immortality, eternal youth, and power. The diary spoke of vampire-like figures not as evil beings, but as enlightened individuals who had found a way to escape the chains of time. The more Sophia read, the more she started to understand that the vampire myth wasn't about creatures lurking in the dark. It was about desire, about the longing for eternal life and freedom from death, concepts that had always haunted humankind. People were fascinated with vampires because they embodied humanity's deepest wishes: escape from mortality, control over life and death, and freedom from suffering. As Sophia continued her research, the boundaries between reality and myth began to blur. She found herself unable to shake the idea that there was a deep, intrinsic pull toward vampires, a pull that went beyond mere curiosity. Late one evening, after reading several more chapters of the old manuscript, Sophia had another dream. This time, Victor appeared in her dream, not as a stranger, but as someone she had known for years. He spoke to her in a voice filled with regret, telling her that she was closer than she thought to uncovering the truth about vampires and about herself. Sophia woke up, sweating, heart racing. She tried to brush the dream aside as just a product of her overactive imagination, but something about it stuck with her. What did he mean by that? What truth was she close to uncovering? The next day, while walking through the streets of London, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The city, normally bustling and lively, felt eerie. There were moments when she thought she saw a figure watching her from the shadows. His eyes, cold and familiar. It was Victor, or at least it felt like him. She quickly dismissed it, but the feeling lingered. Sophia's obsession with the vampire myth led her to take a trip to an obscure library located on the outskirts of London. A library said to house forbidden knowledge about the supernatural. The librarian, an eccentric old man named Elias, took an immediate interest in her work. After some hesitation, he handed her a worn-out book that had no title on its cover. "This," he said in a low voice, "is a collection of all the vampire myths that have existed in every known civilization. Not just stories, histories." Inside the book, Sophia found detailed descriptions of vampire-like beings throughout history. Ancient Egyptian blood drinkers, Sumerian legends of creatures that could shift between worlds, and Chinese folklore about spirits who lived on the life force of the living. But there was something else hidden within these pages, something that made her blood run cold. A single paragraph, barely legible, described an ancient ritual, a way to invite the vampire into your life by merging with them spiritually. It spoke of the power of the vampire not just in blood, but in the energy of their eternal existence. Sophia immediately recognized that the book was not just a collection of stories. It was a guide, a way to connect with the vampire myth. She had unknowingly been walking this path since her first encounter with Victor. She now understood. The fascination with vampires wasn't about terror, but a craving for power, for immortality, for the ability to transcend the human condition. Sophia began researching vampire psychology. She met with a prominent psychologist, Dr. Anthony Ferris, who had studied the concept of immortality and death in human behavior. Dr. Ferris explained that the vampire myth resonates with people on a psychological level because it speaks to the deep-seated fear of mortality. The idea that one could transcend death and live forever is something that appeals to our unconscious desire to avoid the inevitable. But more than that, vampires represent a seductive form of control, the ability to stop time, to control the fate of others, to live outside the normal boundaries of human experience. He also explained how vampires were often portrayed as outsiders or outcasts in many cultures. This marginalization, he suggested, might be why people identify with vampires, because many of us feel isolated, misunderstood, or powerless in some aspect of our lives. Vampires, with their mysterious allure and forbidden power, become symbols of defiance and freedom from societal norms. Sophia listened intently, feeling the weight of his words. It wasn't just the vampire myth that had power, It was the desire for what they represented. Freedom from fear, the need for control, and the escape from the inevitable. Sophia's investigation into the vampire myth takes a deeper, more psychological turn. She learns that vampires are not just about physical immortality, but about the desires that drive human behavior, fear of death, the need for power, and the pursuit of freedom. Her interactions with Victor and the discovery of new texts push her to confront the deeper, more subconscious pull that the vampire myth has on human psyche. Is it merely fascination, or something much more personal? Something that connects all of humanity to the vampire's timeless allure? As Sophia's research progressed, the boundaries between myth and reality began to erode. What had started as a simple academic inquiry had now turned into something far more consuming. She no longer saw vampires as just stories or legends. They were, in a way, a reflection of humanity's deepest, most primal desires. And those desires had begun to pull her in, almost as if the vampire myth was calling her to something much bigger than she could understand. It had been a week since she had last seen Victor, the man who claimed to be a real vampire, and despite her doubts, his presence lingered in her mind. His warning, about being closer than she thought to the truth, echoed constantly in her thoughts. Was he a myth himself, or was there something more to his words? One evening, while reviewing her notes, Sophia found an unfamiliar envelope on her desk. It was unmarked with no return address. Her heart raced as she opened it and found a single sheet of parchment inside, written in elegant, almost otherworldly handwriting. The invitation is yours, should you choose to accept it. It is time to meet the truth. Come to the old manor by the river at midnight. You will know when you arrive. It was signed with a symbol she recognized, the same symbol she had seen in the ancient vampire manuscript she'd found in the library. Sophia was both terrified and mesmerized. There was no way to dismiss it as coincidence now. Victor's words weren't just a cryptic warning. They were a call to action. Sophia couldn't ignore the pull. Despite all the warnings, despite her rational mind screaming at her to walk away, she found herself drawn to the location in the letter. The manor by the river was an old, dilapidated building at the edge of the city, long abandoned and forgotten by most. As she approached the manor that night, the moonlight cast long shadows over the fog-covered ground. The manor loomed ahead like something out of a nightmare, a forgotten relic of a past that shouldn't be disturbed. When she reached the entrance, the heavy door creaked open, seemingly of its own accord. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with dust and time. It felt as if the very walls had memories of their own, holding secrets long buried. Victor was waiting inside. He stood in the center of the grand hall, his presence both commanding and unsettling. His eyes, as cold as they were familiar, locked onto Sophia's with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "You came," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of something far darker. "I knew you would. You're here to understand, aren't you?" Sophia didn't speak immediately. She was drawn to him, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. She had questions, so many questions, but there was something about his presence that made everything seem more complicated than it had been before. Victor led her deeper into the manor, where an ancient stone altar stood, covered with strange symbols and old relics. He began to explain the true nature of vampires, not as cursed creatures, but as individuals who had transcended the limits of human existence. "The truth you seek," Victor said, "is not just about immortality. It's about something much more profound. Vampires are not just victims of a curse. They are chosen to live beyond time, beyond death, because they possess the power to change the very fabric of existence. It is not about surviving. It is about becoming something more than human." Sophia was stunned. The words he spoke felt like they came from a place she couldn't fully grasp, but there was truth in them. She could feel it in her bones. Victor explained how ancient vampires were not just immortal beings. They were the keepers of knowledge, the guardians of forbidden wisdom. Over the centuries, they had lived in the shadows, observing, learning, and sometimes influencing the course of human history. They had transcended the basic needs of the body, allowing them to focus on something greater, the search for enlightenment, control, and ultimate freedom. "The invitation," Victor continued, his eyes now piercing into hers, "wasn't just for you to learn the truth. It was for you to decide whether you were ready to cross the line from human to something more. You have the potential to join us, Sophia, to understand the truth in ways no human ever could. But only if you accept the invitation. Only if you are ready to embrace what lies beyond. Sophia's heart raced. The allure of immortality, the power, the freedom, everything she had studied and believed about vampires was crashing down around her. She could feel the pull, the temptation to say yes. But deep down, she knew the cost would be greater than she could imagine. As the night stretched on, Sophia found herself torn between what she had always believed and what she was beginning to understand. The myth of vampires had never felt so real, so close. And the choice she faced was more than just an academic pursuit. It was a decision about her own future, her place in the world. Victor watched her with a knowing gaze, as if he understood the battle waging inside her. "You are at a crossroads, Sophia," he said softly. "The decision to step beyond the veil is not one to be taken lightly, but you've already seen the signs. You've already felt the pull. You know that this is a path you will walk, whether you do so willingly or not." Sophia now faces a decision: to accept the invitation and cross into the world of vampires, a world of power, immortality, and forbidden knowledge, or to walk away, leaving behind the answers she sought for so long. The lines between myth and reality have blurred, and she stands at the threshold of a new, dangerous reality. Sophia stood in the center of the ancient manor, the cold stone walls enclosing her like a tomb. The air was thick with an ancient energy, heavy with the weight of centuries. Victor's words echoed in her mind. The decision to step beyond the veil is not one to be taken lightly. He had given her an impossible choice: to join him in the world of the undead, to transcend the limitations of humanity, or to walk away from everything she had worked for and believed in. The longer she stood there, the more the lure of immortality seemed to whisper in her ear, like a melody she couldn't escape. Freedom from death, freedom from fear, power beyond measure. It was a tempting promise, one that many had sought before her. Yet Sophia felt a deep unease stirring in her gut. Victor, sensing her hesitation, stepped closer. "Time is fleeting, Sophia. You're at the precipice. The moment for decision is now." Sophia looked into his eyes, cold, ancient, filled with centuries of wisdom and sorrow. They had crossed paths before, but now she saw something new in him. An endless hunger, a sadness that went beyond human comprehension. He wasn't just a vampire. He was something else entirely. Something that had been untouched by time, yet marked by the weight of it. "Is this really what I want?" Sophia whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for her to follow him. As they walked deeper into the manor, the atmosphere shifted, the dim lights flickering as if the place itself was alive. It was as though the walls were watching, listening, awaiting her decision. They stopped before a grand mirror, framed in gold and covered with intricate symbols. It wasn't just any mirror. It was ancient, possibly older than the manor itself. Victor turned to face her. "Look into it," he said softly. "See yourself as you are, and then see yourself as you could be." Sophia hesitated for a moment, then gazed into the mirror. At first, she only saw her reflection. A young woman, full of potential, yet burdened by the weight of mortality. But as her eyes lingered, the reflection began to change. She saw herself no longer aging, no longer burdened by the passage of time. She was beautiful, ageless, her eyes filled with knowledge and power that no human could ever hope to achieve. The woman in the mirror seemed to smile at her, beckoning her to step forward, to become like her. The reflection shifted again. This time, Sophia saw herself drinking blood, not out of necessity, but as an act of transcendence, as if it was an art form, something she had learned to embrace fully. Her eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, her features sharper, her body more powerful, more in control than any human could ever hope to be. For a moment, she felt herself drawn into the image, overwhelmed by the possibilities that lay before her. She could have it all: immortality, power, beauty, and freedom from the struggles of life. But then, a sudden realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just a gift, it was a sacrifice. She would be giving up her humanity, her connections, her ability to truly experience the full range of life's emotions. She would never again feel the rush of living, the joy of fleeting moments. She would be forever detached from the world she once knew. All the people she loved, everything she had fought for, would become distant memories, if not erased entirely. Victor watched her closely as she absorbed the vision in the mirror. "You see it now, don't you?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "What you would gain and what you would lose." Sophia turned to him, her heart pounding. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice filled with confusion and fear. "Why offer this to me? What do you really want?" Victor's expression softened, a sadness clouding his cold eyes. "It's not just about immortality, Sophia. It's about freeing oneself from the chains of time. Time is a prison. We may have power, but we also bear the burden of that power. We are forever trapped in the same cycle, never truly alive, never truly dead." Sophia's mind raced. What Victor was offering wasn't just eternal life, it was freedom from the human condition. But it came at a cost. She would become a creature of the night, living for centuries, unable to connect with the people she once knew, unable to truly experience the human joys and pains that had defined her existence up until now. The choice lay before her, stark and unyielding. Sophia felt the pull of the vampire's world, its promises of power and freedom, but also the deep, aching pull of her humanity, the connections she had to the living, to the world of fleeting moments and experiences. Could she leave it all behind? Could she truly walk away from the life she knew, from her friends, her work, and everything that made her human? Victor stood there, waiting. He had made his offer. Now it was up to her. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of centuries of knowledge and longing. Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, trying to clear her thoughts. She felt torn in two, each part of her pulling her in different directions. The vampire world was seductive. Its promise of immortality was something no human could resist. But could she sacrifice everything she held dear for that eternal life? When Sophia opened her eyes again, she knew what she had to do. The answer wasn't clear-cut. There was no turning back, no easy path forward. But one thing was certain, whatever choice she made would change her life forever. She looked at Victor, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm not ready," she said quietly. "I thought I could accept this, but I can't give up who I am, who I was meant to be." Victor nodded, his expression unreadable. "Very well," he said softly. "But know this, Sophia. You will never be the same. You've tasted the truth. And once you've tasted it, there's no going back." Sophia left the manor that night, but as she stepped into the cool night air, she knew that the door to the vampire world had been opened, and no matter how much she wanted to close it, she knew that some doors, once opened, could never be shut. Sophia's footsteps echoed in the dark streets as she walked away from the old manor by the river. The decision she had made still felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't quite escape. The cool air wrapped around her, but it didn't offer comfort. She could still feel the weight of Victor's gaze, the promises he'd made, lingering on her skin like a touch she couldn't wash off. For the next few days, Sophia tried to return to her normal life. She threw herself into her research, burying herself in the old texts and manuscripts. She hoped the work would provide some form of distraction, a way to push the vampire world out of her mind. But it was no use. Every time she read about the ancient rituals, about the allure of immortality, her mind drifted back to the manor and Victor's invitation. The truth was, the temptation hadn't disappeared. It wasn't that she wanted to become a vampire. It was the idea of immortality, of escaping the inevitable that haunted her. She had rejected it, but the longing for something greater, something beyond human limitations, stayed with her. Sophia began to notice changes in herself. At first, they were small. The subtle shift in how she saw the world, the way her emotions seemed distant at times, as though the depth of human experience no longer fully resonated with her. It was as if she had tasted something forbidden, and now everything else seemed somehow less vibrant, less real. She would wake up in the middle of the night with strange dreams of dark places and shadowy figures, echoes of the manor and the cryptic symbols Victor had shown her. It wasn't just fear. It was a deep sense of longing, as though a part of her had been awakened, and now she couldn't silence it. Victor's words haunted her thoughts. "You will never be the same. You've tasted the truth." And it was true. She hadn't fully realized it then, but her rejection of the vampire world hadn't closed the door. It had cracked it open, leaving a permanent scar on her psyche. The door was always ajar, waiting to be opened again. One rainy evening, as Sophia sat alone in her apartment, there was a soft knock at the door. First, she ignored it, thinking it was just the wind. But then the knock came again, persistent, insistent. Her heart skipped a beat. When she opened the door, there was no one there. But on the ground, just inside the threshold, was a small envelope, sealed with wax. The same symbol from the ancient texts, the symbol from the vampire rituals. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She knew it wasn't just a coincidence. Someone or something was sending a message, a warning, or an invitation. She opened the envelope slowly, her hands trembling. Inside, there was a single typed sentence. "You cannot run from what you've already chosen." Sophia spent the next few days in a haze, unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't just the mysterious note. There was a growing sense that the world around her was subtly shifting, like the edges of reality were beginning to blur. She tried to reach out to Dr. Ferris, the psychologist she had spoken with earlier, but his office was closed. She found herself pulling away from everyone she knew, unable to explain the strange disconnection she felt from her old life. Her friends seemed distant, their words falling flat, their concerns about her well-being almost laughable in the face of the greater truth she was beginning to understand. It wasn't just about the vampires anymore. It was about what she had rejected and why. She had made the choice to walk away, but was she really free? Or had the vampire world marked her, chosen her, even if she didn't want it? One evening, while sitting in a cafe, Sophia caught a glimpse of someone watching her from across the room. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But when their eyes met, she felt an intense, electric pull, a connection that sent a chill down her spine. The man was older, his eyes sharp, almost knowing. He gave her a small nod before standing and leaving. Sophia's heart raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew her, or at least knew something about her that she didn't understand. She followed him outside, but he was gone, vanished into the crowded streets of London, as if he had never been there at all. The encounter left her rattled, and that night, she had another vivid dream. This time, she was standing in the grand hall of the manor again, surrounded by shadows. The air was thick with a palpable energy. Victor was there, waiting for her, his eyes burning with an intensity that felt almost too real. "You should have accepted it," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You can never go back, Sophia. You are already ours." Sophia woke with a start, her breath coming in short gasps. She realized, then, that the choice wasn't truly hers to make. She had rejected the world of vampires, yes, but she hadn't rejected the power they represented. That power had already begun to seep into her, influencing her thoughts, her actions, her very being. The world she once knew, the one where she felt in control, where she could make rational decisions, was slipping through her fingers. Something darker, something more primal was taking hold of her. And no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she couldn't escape the truth. Victor was right. She couldn't run from what she had already chosen. Even in rejecting the vampire world, she had unknowingly accepted it. Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her was changing, something she couldn't control. Her mind, once sharp and focused, now seemed clouded. The world around her had started to lose its clarity, and it felt as though reality itself was slipping through her fingers. The familiar comforts of her old life no longer brought her peace. She spent hours staring out the window of her apartment, watching the rain fall, the rhythmic sound of it pounding against the glass. It should have been soothing, but it wasn't. There was a nagging emptiness inside her, a void that she couldn't fill, no matter how hard she tried. It was as if she were constantly searching for something just out of reach. She thought back to her encounter with the mysterious man, the man who had watched her from across the cafe. His gaze had been intense, knowing, as if he had seen straight into her soul. Who was he? Why did he look at her like that? And why did she feel so drawn to him? It was the same way she felt when she thought about Victor. The same pull, the same seductive, irresistible urge. It had been weeks since she rejected the offer to join the vampire world. But the truth was, she wasn't free. She had tasted the truth, and now it was in her, woven into the very fabric of her being. Sophia had always believed that rejecting the vampire world would allow her to retain control over her life, to keep her humanity intact. But as the days passed, she realized how wrong she was. She could feel the darkness creeping in, and she could no longer deny it. She was changing, and it wasn't just her mind, it was her body too. Her senses had become sharper. The faintest sound was amplified in her ears. The slightest shift in the air made her aware of the people around her, their heartbeats, their breaths. And it wasn't just physical. Her emotions were becoming increasingly detached. She couldn't feel the joy she once had for the little things in life, the warmth of the sun, the smile of a friend, the beauty of a rainy day. Now all of it felt distant, like she was watching someone else live. In the midst of all these changes, she kept asking herself, was this the price of rejecting the vampire world? The longer she held onto her humanity, the more it felt like a heavy weight, one that was becoming unbearable. She no longer felt connected to the people she once loved. She had pulled away from everyone, her friends, her colleagues, even Dr. Ferris. Their concerns about her well-being felt shallow, distant. She was no longer who she used to be, and no matter how much she tried to cling to that past, it was slipping away from her. One evening, as she was walking through the streets of London, lost in thought, she felt the familiar presence again. The same pull, the same undeniable energy. She turned to see Victor standing in the shadows, his face partially obscured by the night, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You can feel it, can't you?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with a knowing undertone. "You're not the same, Sophia. You never will be." Sophia took a step back, her heart racing. She had wanted to avoid him, to push him out of her mind. But here he was, standing before her again, as if fate had willed it. "Why are you doing this to me?" she demanded, her voice trembling with both fear and frustration. "I rejected you. I walked away. I chose to live my life without this. Why won't you leave me alone?" Victor's lips curled into a small, almost sad smile. "You think you can just walk away from the truth? It's inside you now. You've tasted what lies beyond. You can never forget it, and you can never be the same." Sophia shook her head, trying to block him out. "I don't want this. I don't want to become like you." "You already are," Victor said quietly. "The changes have already begun. The question now is, how long can you deny what's within you? How long will you fight it?" That night, Sophia returned to her apartment, but her mind was in turmoil. Victor's words echoed in her ears. "You already are." The truth was undeniable. She could feel it in the way her senses had heightened, the way her emotions had become detached. The very essence of what she was had shifted, and there was no going back. For days, she tried to maintain some semblance of her old life, but it was as if the more she resisted, the more the darkness inside her grew. It wasn't just the physical changes. There was something deeper, something metaphysical that was shifting within her. The very fabric of her being was becoming entwined with something darker, something that had always been there, waiting. One night, as she sat in her apartment, staring into the mirror, she finally saw it, the reflection that had been haunting her. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, were now cold and calculating. Her face, once soft with youth, had become sharper, more defined. The change wasn't just external. It was something inside her, something deep within her soul, that had shifted irreversibly. Sophia stood there, her reflection staring back at her with an intensity she had never felt before. She realized then that the choice was not just about rejecting the vampire world. It was about accepting that her soul had already been touched by it. She had opened the door to something darker, and now it was too late to walk away. The question was no longer whether she would accept the vampire world. It was whether she could ever truly live without it. Victor's voice echoed in her mind, filling her with a sense of both dread and longing. "You can never go back." Sophia felt a chill run through her. She was trapped in a world of her own making. The darkness had already seeped into her life, and now it was asking her to either embrace it fully or be consumed by it. Sophia couldn't remember the last time she had truly felt human. The days blended together in a haze of confusion, frustration, and longing. She spent her time between her apartment and the research institute, but even there, she couldn't concentrate. Her mind kept drifting back to that night in the manor, to Victor's words, and to the mirror that had shown her what she could become. The changes were undeniable now. Her senses had sharpened to an almost unbearable level, and the slightest sounds, smells, and sights overwhelmed her. It wasn't just that her body was transforming. It was that she no longer recognized herself. The reflection in the mirror was a stranger, someone both familiar and alien. The human emotions that had once driven her, love, joy, fear, felt distant, like memories of a life she had once lived. She tried to ignore it, tried to go on as if nothing had changed. But it was impossible. The pull of the vampire world was too strong, like a magnetic force drawing her in. She could feel it deep within her, an undeniable hunger, no longer for blood, but for power. The desire to transcend her human limitations was stronger than ever. It wasn't just about immortality anymore. It was about control. The control she had once longed for over her own fate, over time itself, was now within her reach. But with that power came a terrifying responsibility. Could she truly control it? Or would it control her? Late one evening, as she walked through the city streets, something happened that would change everything. She was walking past a dark alley when she heard a voice. A faint whisper, so soft she almost missed it. But when she turned, she saw a man standing there, his eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. It was the same man from the cafe, the one who had watched her before, the one who seemed to know her. His presence was overwhelming, like an electric current running through the air. "You've been running from yourself, Sophia," the man said, his voice smooth and hypnotic. "But you can't hide from what you are anymore." Sophia took a step back, heart racing. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The man stepped closer, and for the first time, she realized just how tall he was, how commanding his presence felt. "I am one who has walked the same path," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I am a guide, and I have been sent to help you understand what you've become." Sophia's pulse quickened. "I don't need your help. I don't want this," she said, trying to push past him, but he blocked her path effortlessly. "You can't deny what's within you," he said, his eyes dark and intense. "You've already tasted the truth. You've already crossed the line. But there's more for you, Sophia. Power beyond what you've ever imagined. Control over your own fate. Control over everything." Sophia felt the pull again, the same draw that had first led her to the manor, to Victor. It was the same temptation, the same promise of power. But this time it was different. This man, this figure standing before her, was offering something even more than what Victor had offered. He wasn't just offering immortality. He was offering total control, the ability to shape the world according to her will. For the first time since her encounter with Victor, Sophia considered the possibility. Could she embrace this power? Could she use it for something greater than herself? Or would it consume her, as it had consumed so many others? "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you offering this to me?" The man's lips curled into a slight smile. "Because you are the one who has been chosen, the one who will unlock the power of the vampire world, the one who will lead them into a new age. The choice is yours, Sophia. Accept the power and you will never be bound by time again. You will be free." Sophia felt her heart race as the weight of his words settled in. This wasn't just about her. It was about something far greater than herself. The vampire world wasn't just a world of immortals. It was a world of untapped power, a power that could reshape the very fabric of existence. The man extended his hand toward her, an invitation to something both terrifying and thrilling. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, a force that called to her in ways she couldn't explain. Every instinct within her screamed to take it, to accept what he was offering. The vampire world was hers for the taking. The power, the freedom, everything she had ever longed for was right there, within her grasp. But then, she remembered Victor's face, his words. "You'll never be the same, Sophia. You'll be ours, forever." And something inside her clicked. Was that what she really wanted? "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice steadier this time. "What do you really want from me?" The man's smile faded slightly. "I am one of the ancients, one of the first. The vampire world needs a leader, someone who can unite the clans, someone who can wield the power of the ages. That someone is you." Sophia hesitated, her mind racing. She thought back to her life before this, the human life she had once known. Could she really leave all of that behind? Could she truly walk away from everything she had built, everything she had felt, to embrace this dark power? For a moment, she felt a flicker of doubt, but the hunger inside her, the hunger for control, for power, was overwhelming, and it told her that this was her destiny. She had already crossed the line. There was no going back. With a deep breath, Sophia stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She took the man's hand. "I accept," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As soon as her hand touched his, a rush of energy surged through her. The world around her seemed to shudder, and for the first time in her life, Sophia felt a power like nothing she had ever imagined. She was alive in a way that no human had ever been. The weight of centuries seemed to fall upon her shoulders, and yet, she felt free. But with that freedom came a cost. Sophia knew that her decision had sealed her fate. She was no longer human. She was no longer a mere scholar of the supernatural. She was a part of it now, bound to the vampire world and its ancient power. Sophia awoke to a different reality. Her senses had sharpened even further since she had accepted the man's offer. The world around her had taken on a new dimension. Colors were more vivid, sounds were sharper, and even the air felt alive with energy. She could hear the distant hum of the city's heartbeat, feel the pulse of every living thing around her. But with this heightened awareness came an overwhelming sense of weight. The power she had embraced was vast, but it was also heavy. It wasn't just the physical strength that had changed. She could now manipulate the world around her, control the elements, bend the will of others to her own desires. Yet she wasn't entirely free. There was a cost to this power, a cost that she hadn't fully understood until now. The man, who had revealed himself as a sim, one of the ancient vampires, had shown her the first steps of controlling her newfound abilities. But as he had warned her, mastery would take time. Power wasn't something that could be wielded without consequence. Every time she used it, it took something from her. Something deep, something essential to her humanity. The weight of immortality had already begun to sink in. She had made her choice, but now she had to live with it. Sophia's first real test came sooner than she expected. A sim had told her that she needed to prove her strength to the other vampire clans. Show them that she could lead, that she had what it took to control not only the power within her, but also the factions of the vampire world. One evening, a messenger arrived with a challenge. A rival clan, led by Tarek, one of the most feared vampire lords, had heard of her rise to power. They demanded a meeting, and with that, Sophia's role as a leader in the vampire world had truly begun. Tarek's clan was known for its ruthlessness and their unyielding thirst for power. Sophia had heard stories about them, about how they would take what they wanted no matter the cost, and now she was being summoned to face them. A sim's warning echoed in her mind. Do not underestimate them. They will test you, push you to the edge. But remember, you have something they do not. Sophia arrived at the meeting place, a vast, abandoned cathedral that had been repurposed into a dark sanctuary for Tarek's clan. The air was thick with tension as she stepped inside. Her senses immediately picked up on the presence of others. Vampires, hidden in the shadows, waiting to see how she would react. Tarek himself stood at the altar, his dark eyes fixed on her as she approached. He was tall, with an imposing figure, his features sharp and angular. His aura radiated power and authority, and yet Sophia could sense something else, something dangerous. This was a vampire who had lived for centuries, and he had no intentions of letting anyone, least of all her, take his place. So, you are the new leader, Tarek said, his voice laced with amusement. I must admit, I wasn't expecting much from you. You're young, inexperienced, but you've been making quite a name for yourself. Sophia stood tall, meeting his gaze with confidence, even as the weight of his words pressed down on her. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. I'm here because I have something you don't, she replied, her voice steady and calm. I have the power to reshape this world. Tarek chuckled, his laugh dark and cold. Power? You think you can stand against me? You may have abilities beyond human comprehension, but you don't know what it means to lead. You don't understand the sacrifices it takes. Sophia stepped forward, feeling the power within her stirring, ready to rise to the challenge. I understand more than you think, Tarek. I know what it takes to lead. I know what it means to make decisions that change everything." The tension in the room thickened, and before Sophia could react, Tarek's clan surged forward, their movements lightning fast, intent on testing her resolve. She could feel the power inside her rising. She had to use it. There was no turning back now. The battle was fierce. Tarek's clan moved as one, their strength almost overwhelming. But Sophia didn't hesitate. She summoned the power of the elements, wind, fire, and shadow, to fight back, her body moving with a fluid grace she had never experienced before. The power surged through her like wildfire, and for the first time, she felt alive, truly alive, in a way she hadn't since her transformation. She could feel her enemy's power, their thoughts, their movements before they even made them. With a snap of her fingers, she twisted the air around them, throwing them off balance. She could hear their shocked gasps as they struggled to regain control, but she didn't give them the chance. The power, once a distant dream, was now an extension of herself. She was no longer just Sophia Aldrich. She was something more. She was power incarnate. But with every strike, every move, she could feel the strain on her soul. The power she wielded was intoxicating, but it demanded more than she could give. She had to master it or it would consume her. As the dust settled and the battle ended, Sophia stood victorious. The members of Tarek's clan lay defeated at her feet, their strength broken by her relentless power. But she didn't feel triumphant. Instead, there was an emptiness that gnawed at her, the aftermath of using that much power. Tarek, still standing but clearly wounded, looked at her with a mixture of respect and begrudging admiration. "You are powerful, I'll give you that," he said. "But power alone won't make you a leader. You've shown them that you can fight, that you can defeat your enemies. But leadership requires more than strength. It requires wisdom, patience, and the ability to make choices that weigh heavier than any victory." Sophia nodded slowly, understanding his words. She had proven her strength, but Tarek was right. Being a leader was about more than just fighting. It was about maintaining control, balancing power, and not losing yourself in the process. But for now, she had one thing. She had one. And that was enough. Sophia stood on the balcony of her new sanctuary, overlooking the dark expanse of the city. The weight of the night pressed down on her, the skyline bathed in the cold glow of streetlights, shadows creeping along the buildings. She had won the battle against Tarek's clan, but the victory didn't feel like one. Instead, it felt like a heavy, suffocating cloak wrapped around her shoulders, something she couldn't quite escape, no matter how hard she tried. The power within her still buzzed, pulsing through her veins like wildfire, but it no longer felt like the exhilarating force it once had. Now, it was something she had to contain, something that constantly threatened to consume her if she lost control. The mansion she now occupied was a symbol of her new life, her new role as a leader of the vampire world. The other clans, still shaken by her defeat of Tarek's group, had come to recognize her strength, some even bending the knee in reluctant respect. But there was no true peace. Power had a cost, and it was something she hadn't fully understood until now. Sophia had spent the past few days pondering everything. The choice she made to embrace this power, the consequences of becoming the leader of a world that thrived on control, manipulation, and fear. She had led the vampires into a new era of dominance, but it wasn't a reign that would be easily accepted by all. And that was where the true struggle lay. As time passed, Sophia found herself at the center of growing unrest. The other vampire factions, though outwardly compliant, were beginning to question her leadership. While some respected her strength, others felt uneasy about the sudden rise of a leader so young, so inexperienced. Whispers of doubt and rebellion began to circulate. Some factions saw her as a puppet leader, another tool in the hands of the ancient vampires who had guided her to power. Others believed that her newfound power would eventually tear her apart, that she was too ambitious, too reckless to lead. Sophia knew the fractures were forming, but she didn't know how to fix them. The vampire world was ancient, built on centuries of tradition, bloodshed, and alliances that were as fragile as they were deadly. And now she was caught in the middle of it all. One evening, as she convened with her most trusted advisors, a shadowy figure approached her. Lyra, the leader of the Eastern Clan, one of the most powerful vampire factions. Lyra had been a key ally in Sophia's rise to power, but there was something in her gaze now that Sophia couldn't quite place. It was calculating, cold, even a little disdainful. "You've done well, Sophia," Lyra said, her voice smooth, her eyes sharp. "But you've forgotten one crucial thing." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "The balance of power," Lyra replied, her lips curling into a thin smile. "You've proven yourself strong, but strength alone doesn't keep the peace. It just makes people afraid of you. Fear, while useful, doesn't inspire loyalty. And loyalty is what you'll need if you want to keep your throne." Sophia's gaze hardened. "I've led with strength, and it's kept them in line. For now," Lyra agreed, her tone dripping with irony. "But it won't last. People are restless. They want to see whether you're truly capable of leading them into a new age. They want more than just power, they want purpose." Sophia took a step forward, meeting Lyra's gaze head-on. "And what do you suggest I do? Talk them into submission? Let them question me at every turn?" Lyra's smile faded. "I suggest you remember what made you strong. You've already rejected your humanity, but there's still something you need to hold on to. Something that will keep you grounded." Sophia paused. "And what would that be?" Lyra's eyes darkened. "Compassion. Leadership is about inspiring those beneath you to follow, not out of fear, but out of respect. You'll need to decide if you want to rule with an iron fist, or if you want to create a world that respects you as more than just a ruler." Sophia stood still, her mind swirling. Lyra's words were unsettling, but they held a kernel of truth. She had focused so much on power, on the fight to control her destiny, that she had forgotten the one thing that made her truly human. Her ability to connect with others, her ability to care. She had turned her back on it, but maybe, just maybe, it was the key to keeping the vampires from descending into chaos. Later that night, as Sophia sat alone in her room, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. She had embraced the darkness, and with it, the vampire world had become hers to control. But as she watched her reflection, she saw more than just power. She saw the growing distance between who she was now and who she had once been. Could she really lead this new world without losing herself entirely? Could she strike the balance between power and compassion, between control and freedom? The reflection in the mirror stared back at her with a haunting familiarity. She didn't recognize the woman she had become. She had rejected her humanity for power, but now she wondered if it was worth the cost. Sophia closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and made a decision. The vampire world needed her leadership, but more importantly, it needed her humanity. To rule with an iron fist would make her a tyrant, but to lead with compassion, that would make her a true leader. The next day, Sophia gathered the leaders of the vampire clans in the Grand Hall. The air was thick with tension, as each faction eyed her warily. Lyra's words echoed in her mind, and she knew what she had to do. It was time to show them that she could be both a ruler and someone they could respect. "I have led with strength," she began, her voice steady. "But I understand that power alone does not sustain a kingdom. It is trust, loyalty, and respect that make a leader, and it is those things I will fight for." She saw the shift in the room. Some vampires still looked skeptical, but others, the ones who had been questioning her leadership, now looked at her with new eyes. "From this moment forward," Sophia continued, her gaze unwavering, "I will not rule by fear. I will rule with the understanding that leadership is not just about power. It is about uniting us all under one purpose. We are stronger together than we are divided." The room was silent. The vampires looked at one another, unsure of what to make of her words. Sophia didn't know if they would accept her decision, but she knew she had to try. Days passed, and the vampire world was still in flux. Sophia had begun implementing her vision, blending her strength with the compassion she had reclaimed. There were victories, yes, but also setbacks. Some of the clans accepted her leadership willingly, others were slow to follow, and a few, like Tarek's faction, had gone underground, their rebellion brewing in the shadows. But Sophia stood firm. She was determined not to let fear dictate the future. The power inside her had grown, and so had the weight of her choices. Every decision she made affected not just the vampire world, but the very essence of who she was. She wasn't sure if she was becoming the leader she had hoped to be, or if the vampire world was changing her into someone she no longer recognized. She sat in her study, poring over the ancient vampire texts, looking for guidance. The manuscripts spoke of balance, of the need for both power and compassion, but the words seemed far removed from the reality of her situation. She realized then that the true test would come not from her enemies, but from within. Could she maintain her humanity while ruling over beings who had long since abandoned theirs? The answer, she knew, would be found in her next choice. It was late when the knock came at her door. She opened it to find Victor, standing in the shadows, his pale face illuminated by the soft glow of the hallway lights. His presence filled the room, like an old, familiar ghost. "You've done well," he said quietly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You've managed to unite them, for now." Sophia didn't flinch. "What do you want, Victor?" "I'm here to remind you," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, "that this world, the world of vampires, has no place for weakness. It has no place for compassion. You're still clinging to the very thing that will drag you down." Sophia stood tall, her gaze steady. "I'm not clinging to anything. I'm choosing to lead in a way that's different from the path you followed. I'm choosing a future where power doesn't have to come at the cost of everything else." Victor chuckled darkly. "You think you can change what we are? You're not the first to try, and you won't be the last. Vampires are creatures of the night, beasts that feed on power and blood. Compassion, empathy, these are human traits. You will always be torn between who you are and what you've become. And one day, the world you've built will come crashing down." Sophia's heart raced, but she didn't back away. "You may be right about the world," she said, her voice hardening, "but I will build it anyway. This is my choice, my burden to bear. I won't run from it." Victor looked at her with something close to pity. "So be it," he said quietly before turning to leave. "But remember, Sophia, you can't escape the darkness. It's part of you now. It always will be." In the days that followed, Sophia found herself standing at a crossroads once again. The growing unrest among the vampire clans was undeniable, and her leadership was being tested like never before. Factions that had once supported her were beginning to question her decisions. Some whispered that she was weakening, that her vision of a peaceful world for vampires was unrealistic. One night, as Sophia walked through the mansion's halls, she heard the sound of hushed voices. The leaders of the clans had gathered again, but this time, it was different. They weren't just asking for her leadership, they were demanding it. They wanted her to make a choice, to rule with absolute authority, to crush any opposition, or to step down and let the vampire world descend into chaos. Sophia's heart raced as she stepped into the grand hall, where the factions had gathered. The tension was palpable, thick in the air. She had done everything she could to unite them, to build a world where compassion could coexist with power. But now they were challenging her, testing her resolve. "Will you lead us as a queen, or will you let us fall into darkness?" One of the vampire lords, Allure, demanded, his eyes sharp with challenge. Sophia paused. The choice was in front of her, stark and clear. She could take control, use the power she had to crush her enemies and secure her rule. She could become the cold, calculating ruler that Victor had always warned her she would be. Or she could reject that path, continue to fight for a world that balanced power with compassion, but in doing so, risk losing everything she had fought for. Sophia's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the clan leaders, each one waiting for her decision. The weight of their stares felt heavier than the weight of her immortality. She thought about the long nights, the battles, the sacrifices she had made. She thought about Victor's words, and how they had echoed in her mind every day since she had chosen this path. She could feel the darkness within her, a shadow that had crept into her soul the moment she had embraced the vampire world. But she wasn't afraid anymore. "I will not rule through fear," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I will not become what you think I should be. I am not here to destroy, I am here to build. And if that means losing everything, then I will lose it. But I will not give up on my vision." The room was silent. For a moment, Sophia thought she had failed, that they would reject her once and for all. But then, slowly, one by one, the leaders began to lower their eyes, nodding in reluctant respect. Sophia had passed the final test, not by conquering others, but by staying true to herself. As the leaders of the vampire world slowly accepted her decision, Sophia realized that the road ahead would be long and uncertain. Her choices had set her on a path that no one, not even she, could predict. But for the first time since she had embraced the vampire world, she felt at peace with herself. The world she had entered was a dangerous, brutal one, but it was hers to lead, and she would not shy away from the responsibility. Victor's voice echoed in her mind, but this time, she didn't listen. She had made her choice, and the future, no matter how dark or uncertain, was hers to shape.